You're listening to episode 150 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Sevinc returns to the podcast to speak about the latest research on mindfulness and fear responses. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what's shared here, know that this is made possible from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. When looking at scientific research, sometimes a question comes up. So what? There's a measurable resizing or thickening in some parts of the brain, but how does that actually show up and maybe change things outside of a brain scan? Today we talk about one such paper that has a trifecta I always get excited about: good science, good active controls, and measurable changes that have tremendous potential to help people. Sevinc is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Her PhD dissertation focused on neural networks associated with moral cognition, especially those involved in the detection of morally relevant stimuli. Her current research interests include the relationship between mindfulness meditation and moral cognition. She is specifically interested in the structural and functional changes associated with mindfulness practice as they relate to moral behavior and pro-sociality. Currently, she is utilizing multivariate neuroimaging analysis methods to investigate the effects of mindfulness practice in improving cognition. Our guest today, returning to the podcast, is researcher and my friend Sevinc. Welcome to the podcast. So wonderful to see you again.
Hi, Ted. Welcome. I'm really glad to be here as well.
I'm always so enthusiastic whenever I get to speak with you or anyone else in Sarah Lazar's lab. So I just want to take a moment and do a shout out to everyone there and the wonderful work that you're all doing.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So let's start with a little bit of background before we dive into the details of this new paper that you've written. And for those who are listening who may not have heard my previous conversation with Gunesh, I'll have a link to that on the episode page for this episode. So just go to that and I'll have that link for you. But for this one, the new paper, let's have a little bit of background on the hippocampus as it applies to the research you've been doing here.
First, I would like to let the listeners know that the paper has received a lot of attention, and it's among the most downloaded article within the last 3 months of the journal Biological Psychiatry. So we are happy with the interest it all receives. And of course, learning and memory, hippocampus are all hot topics for both the field of meditation and also the field of learning and memory. Especially speaking of learning and memory, hippocampus is the center for learning, especially the retrieval phase of it. So when we say learning, it reminds other things, but it's like the basis of how we survive. So it's learning the association between stimulus and response, stimulus and other stimulus. So it's very critical to how we navigate in the world, how we function healthily or unhealthily. And it has three phases, which are acquisition, consolidation, and retrieval. So first, an association is formed between stimulus or response, or stimulus or another stimulus. And then it needs to be consolidated, and it needs to be healthily retrieved in case of needed. So hippocampus is especially a tiny, teeny region in the temporal lobe, hippocampi actually, in both temporal lobes, and it's involved in the retrieval phase of that learning experience. So it's a very critical region. It's the first, the region that deteriorates first in the aging, cognitive decline associated with aging. So it's very critical in for functioning in life.
So if I'm understanding correctly, we'll have some sort of experience, and that will trigger this cascade, these three different steps involve the hippocampus, where there's an association with some condition as part of this learning experience. And so in the future, at some point, it might be a smell that reminds us of something and recreates a moment, or a song that pulls us in some way, or some other kind of stimulus that triggers. And it may be a very pleasant trigger and something wonderful that brings a smile to our face, or it might be something a little less pleasant, something a little more unwanted. And that may bring us to a little bit of what your hypothesis was and what you were studying here. I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit more about that and what the hypotheses were for this training.
So meditation, we know that it helps with anxiety, with stress, with other emotion regulation. So it's tremendously helpful, but we don't know how. And there have been mechanisms that are proposed, such as emotion regulation, better memory, better attention, but we don't really know what in the brain happens, which translates into health benefits associated with mindfulness meditation-based intervention methods. So one of the proposed mechanisms relies on the overlap between exposure therapy and mindfulness meditation. And to be able to explain that, I first need to explain exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is a therapy technique that is widely used. It's simply it involves creating a safe space for the individual and then making the individual retrieve that anxiety-provoking experience. So let's say they have a fear of cats, and in a therapy settings, therapists would ask the participant to imagine a cat coming closer towards them. So this is type of an exposure situation where an individual is gradually exposed to the fear-invoking stimuli. So as every type of learning, we tend to consider these experiences as like forgetting or modifying the experience, but it's actually a new learning. Mm-hmm. So the previous learning was cat, oh my God, fear, and now the new learning would be, in very layman's terms, would be cat, safe. Mm-hmm. So it was first cat, unsafe, now it's cat, oh my God, it's a cat, oh, it's safe. So it's not learning or changing the previous learning, but a new type of learning. Now, the critical thing with this one is that when we are exposed to the stimuli again, let's say cat again, mm-hmm. the two types of learning compete with each other. So am I going to recall the previous unhealthy one, or the healthy one, like safe or unsafe, depends on the contextual information provided to me by the hippocampus. This is why hippocampus is very critical during retrieval. And now when we go back to the overlap between exposure therapy and meditation, meditation, as we all know, is does exactly this. So the memory, unsafety memory of a cat becomes safe. So we just notice and stimuli, we say, instead of reacting to it, we just observe. So the meaning of the stimulus changes, not the meaning, but the association it brings about changes.
Yeah, you're laying down new pathways. And as you were saying, new learning. It's not the old one disappears because you still have that memory that's still there. And when this new learning comes up, it sounds like with mindfulness, I'm really curious how this went in the study, that with mindfulness, as we know from other kinds of mindfulness studies, which you have done, there's a greater executive function control about choosing which path am I going to take? What is the choice I'm going to make in this moment?
Exactly. It's the retrieval part, which memory we are going to retrieve depends on the many things, but above all, attention we deploy. So this is also where meditation or mindfulness meditation based benefits come from. One other finding to back these, how critical this is the recent findings associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's say veterans coming from war, they can, like when they hear a loud noise, they freak out, right? This is a very anxiety-provoking noise for them. When they go through exposure therapy, they can learn the new association. So they can say when they hear a loud noise, they can teach themselves that it's safe. But after a while, when they hear it all of a sudden without the therapy setting, outside the therapy setting, they again react to that in an anxiety provoking, like they freak out again in response to the loud noise. And the reason for that was unexplainable to science, but more recently we know that it's because the damage they receive to their hippocampi due to the pressure of the within the skull, like the physical destruction of their hippocampi makes it harder for them to not learn the new association, but retrieve the new association when it's necessary. So this is why hippocampus is really critical to healthy emotional functioning.
Wow, that is fascinating. So there is a new pathway that's created. There are new connections made. And it's not that they're not there and very strong and can be created with care under supportive conditions, which of course we do, particularly in mindfulness programs. We try to establish a space that's as safe as it can be and have that comfort and support for people. But the problem is retrieving them, and because of actual neurological damage that may exist in the hippocampus. It's fascinating. Thank you for that explanation. That helps a great deal.
Thank you. It's like the background is, it's complicated actually. It's there but not there. It has to be retrieved but efficiently, and the hippocampus provides contextual information. But what is context in daily life is
right.
Like everything can be regarded as context in a learning setting. So
yeah,
thanks.
And you can't recreate and have the supportive classroom environment with you wherever you go. Outside of that, it's a very different kind of random environment that you may run into.
So the body may become a context if we utilize the information. And this is one of our findings, actually pinpoints to bodily sensations. Once they are attended to, the connectivity strength between hippocampi and the sensory cortex strength gets stronger. So maybe that bodily sensations provides a context, which in turn translates into better retrieval of the newly learned association, which is, hey, everything is okay, you are safe now.
That's interesting. So the context not being, I have to take the classroom with me, but the context, the safe space being this body. Me right now, and I'm typically not very far from me. And in fact, the more I am present and aware, the more I remain in that safe, supportive context. It's not the classroom, it's whatever this somatic experience may be.
That's the idea, I hope.
Okay, so I understand from the paper, and also for those listening, so you know, the link to the paper itself is on the episode page, so you can read this for yourself. Please do. It's fascinating reading. And so there's a hypothesis with this, that mindfulness training can create those ideal exposure conditions, that there's heightening attention and awareness through that sensory experience. That leads to a better extinction learning, so that rewiring we're talking about. There's improved emotion regulation, which is also something we're familiar with from your work with mindfulness, and potentially reduced anxiety symptoms. That as there's less reaction to anxiety, the symptoms themselves don't get triggered. So I want to hear about the study structure. You had a mindfulness group, a control group, all of that. What was that like?
Sure. So this is, again, a randomized controlled experiment, the gold standard of science when delineating mechanisms associated with interventions, including drug interventions or any kind of surgical interventions that is used in the medical field. So we use a randomized controlled experiment design, which means we invited people. We told them about two potential intervention methods. One is mindfulness-based stress reduction. The other is the stress management education. They are, of course, matched in terms of time spent in classes, homeworks, and everything else. They have to match in terms of how much we intervene to the dose. And the stress management education was a very active control condition. In fact, it was so active that it reduced stress as much as mindfulness-based stress reduction did. But I'm switching to results now here, but I'm excited to let the listeners know that mindfulness-based both interventions reduce stress, but mindfulness-based intervention method was influential also in regulating improvements in difficulties in emotion regulation, so improved emotion regulation, and also anxiety symptoms got a lot better compared to the stress management education. And that intervention method had information on diet, on exercise, on how to manage stress. So everything except mindfulness-based methods. It was a very active control condition. They participated weekly classes for 8 weeks, did the homeworks every day, and at the end of we first scanned participants' brain using a two-day fear conditioning paradigm, and then after the interventions again. So participants were randomized, everything like we did our best to control for non-specific effects. So it's in terms of design-wise, it was optimized to measure what mindfulness meditation specifically does beyond stress reduction.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that is a point I like to highlight when we have really preferred study methodologies like this. Is it's not the mindfulness group and the wait group, the wait list, which is no intervention, because you're not really controlling for mindfulness, because there's an entire experience that happens when you're in a group that itself can have salutary effects and does. And so seeing an active control group where not only are they doing something that's not mindfulness, so they have the same hours and effort, the same cognitive load for this, but it's also something that I really liked hearing and seeing in the paper, is that this was not just a kind of a dummy active intervention. It was something that could still help them. There were people who were suffering, and this was something that was also effective in helping them. So thank you for having an active control group that did also have positive benefits, and intentionally so.
Thanks to NIH and all our funders for that, but thank you.
So let's talk a little bit more on the results. So on the hypothesis, of course, the expected improved emotion regulation. I'm kind of curious about, was there a measure for attention and awareness of sensory experience? Was that something that was able to be tested in this particular study?
Yes and no. So we had a measure. Actually, this is I may need to talk about the paradigm we use within the scanner. So this research is also critical because we used a very sensitive paradigm to measure hippocampal base retrieval of extinguished stimuli. So it was a participant had to come in 2 consecutive days. They first learned an association between, like they were shown a context, a library room or a living room. And then they were shown different types of lights like blue, red, and yellow. And then some of those lights were paired with electric shocks. And so we really, really shocked people, mild shocks, like they were painful, but not too painful.
This does go through an ethical review board, everyone. So
Yes.
it is approved. This is science and people know what they're getting into.
Yes, unfortunately, but it's good science. We are thankful to them for participating in such a setting. So there are 2 different contexts. First, they learn the association that a certain type of light is going to be paired with electrical shock, so unpleasant stimuli. And then again, in day 1, they are presented with a different type of contextual information. If it was library room, now it's a living room. And in the living room, they are shown the light, but this time there is no painful shock associated with it. So they learn that the new context is kind of safe. So the next day, we again invite them to the lab and show them the context which they learned that it was safe. So for some participants, we expect for like a healthy participant would recall the second association. So they would see the context and they would say, oh, this one was safe anyways, regardless of the light I see, I shouldn't feel anything, or I shouldn't be scared, or I shouldn't respond to whatever I see in there. But that's not the case. Typically, we see some neural response. We call it failure to retrieve the newly learned association. So we did this at baseline and we did at post. And there is a measure we collected called skin conductivity index. And there is a measure called extinction retention index that is derived from skin conductivity rates. So we use that skin conductivity rate as a measure of how well they remembered that a stimulus was no longer associated with painful stimuli.
So how did that go? What happened?
Well, that didn't go as planned.
It's also part of science.
Yes, it's also part of science. First of all, a functional MRI signal interferes with the signal of skin conductivity, and it's a very cold area. Like if listeners were scanned, it's very cold. It's extremely difficult to get signal associated with skin conductivity. So we didn't have enough signal and therefore enough power to reliably show in terms of skin conductivity rate that extinction retention was improved. But we were able to show that although both interventions improved stress, mindfulness intervention was better at emotion regulation, like improving emotion regulation and also anxiety symptoms. So as outcome measures, we had those to rely on, plus the neural signal during the retrieval of extinguished stimuli. So we had to rely on those, and we ended up dropping there was just not enough data to conclude from. Not that we didn't find any change, but there wasn't enough good signal to be used, to make use of.
And there's an important distinction here, is that there's a threshold by which signal is strong enough to use. So for someone maybe listening like, well, wait a minute, they threw out data that didn't match. Like, no, it's not that. It wasn't that there wasn't any. It wasn't that it didn't match the hypothesis, so it got thrown out. It's that there wasn't a strength enough to be reliable. And I think that is also a hallmark of good science. It's not that, oh, this didn't match what we want, so we're throwing it out. That's not what happened. This wasn't strong enough to show anything reliably. So we can't use it with any kind of integrity towards the science.
Thanks for the explanation. Exactly. Exactly. We have to make sure that we have good enough signal at both time points to be able to make longitudinal conclusions. For instance, we had a correlation between a hippocampal signal and extinction retention index at baseline. Basically, because we had enough data at baseline, we were able to make that conclusion. And the figure shows nicely, the more they were able to retrieve that the stimulus was no longer associated with painful stimuli, the more signal at hippocampus. So we were able to show that the signal we are receiving at specific region of hippocampus was relevant and was there at baseline, but only at baseline.
So I'm wondering, just on a personal note, was there anything interesting or surprising to you, or maybe you remember some of your colleagues were like, now that I wasn't expecting that. What were some of the things for you that made you go, wow?
Yes, thank you for asking that. One of them is there was an enhanced activation in a region that is involved in attention to memory contents. So that was surprising to me and Dr. Milad, who is the designer of the paradigm that we use in the scanner. He is the leading learning and memory expert, and we are using his paradigm to test the similarity between exposure and mindfulness meditation. The learning and memory folks never emphasize the importance of attention. So that region was both surprising to them and new to them, and also matched very well with the premises of what mindfulness meditation does. So I was very excited to see, because it is a contribution to both their field and also our field in terms of mechanism. So I was excited about that. And also I was excited about, Dr. Lazar has found changes in gray matter structure, but we didn't know what they meant functionally. So this is the first paper that investigates whether how structural changes in the hippocampus predicts activation changes at post. So this is the first study that links structural changes, these fancy brain pictures, and turns them into what is changing during a functionally. So what's happening really?
Yeah, how is it showing up? It's like, it's a neat picture of the brain. It looks different, but what is that? How is that showing up? This is the paper that's for showing that.
Yes, exactly. So we showed how structural change in the hippocampus predicted activity at post during enhanced retrieval. And also the regions that we found for that specific analysis was all the regions associated in context-based retrieval, like the retrosplenial cortex. So it again reliably shows how critical contextual information is. Context-based information, and context is whatever you think the context is, including your body most of the cases. As long as you pay attention, it's there for you. Is my conclusion, but of course I'm...
Well, more research on that, but it makes sense. I think you're right, that if the context that I keep bringing myself back to, and this is really based on what you just said about attention being such an important part of this, and that being something that the folks on the learning side weren't really focusing as much on, is that, of course, if you're meditators will know this, continually refreshing awareness of present moment experience and somatic experience, that becomes the context. But in order to do that, attention has to be a big part of that practice, and the intentionality of it that mindfulness brings. Of course, we would kind of expect that. So it was just so pleasant to hear you say how this was helping in this other discipline too, with some, okay, so here's another aspect that maybe we also want to pay attention to this. And I'm wondering if there are other things in mind, other interesting or surprising things, or maybe some future applications that come to mind too.
Sure. There is one more very interesting finding, again, with about the body. So we found enhanced connectivity between the hippocampus and a cluster in sensory cortex. This means this finding was specific to mindfulness-based intervention, so didn't survive group by time analysis. So we don't know reliably that the control group does not do that. But for mindfulness group only, at least during recall, they were able to, while they were recalling that it was okay for them, they were not getting shocked. The coupling between hippocampus and a cluster in sensory cortex increased. And the cluster, like said, they have a memory of not getting shocked in the place where exactly they received those shocks. So it was close to the hand area. Really? So they are activating the memory of not getting shocked. Mm-hmm. It's because for us, not means there's nothing there. So it's harder to link enhanced activation with the memory of something not being there, but it overlaps perfectly with the new association being a new learning experience, being a new association, not disappearance of the other one.
Right. It doesn't go away. It's still there.
Yes, and they were better at enhancing, they were better at utilizing that sensory information when they are retrieving that, hey, it's safe, it's okay, I'm okay. And then it was also associated with improvements in all sorts of behavioral measures, health outcomes. So I think this is another very exciting aspect of the study. And for future studies, so this was done with stressful individuals, but not people with anxiety disorders or people with real phobias, or people with PTSD. So it would be really nice if we could replicate some of these findings in a different population with specific types of phobia and using phobia-specific stimuli, because this was lights and library rooms and it was very artificial. So it would be really nice to be able to use patients and also patient-specific stimuli associated with anxiety.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for that overview of the paper. That is really, it's fascinating to hear the different aspects of what's unique about this, what is special about it. And that's what happens when you and others from the lab and other researchers come on and give voice to this work, because it can be challenging for us non-scientists to wade through a paper. And so hearing this is important because this is the first time we're showing stuff happens because of what we're observing in these brain scans. Mm-hmm. And it's important to know it's not that we're trying to eliminate a thought or a memory. And we say this in guidance all the time, is we're not trying to push that away or stop it. We're creating additional ones and learning that, and the brain, a particular area of it, in this case, the hippocampus, plays a role in that retrieval. And that's really where that just opens up so many possibilities of what the context is, and can the context be something that is portable, that's always with us. And there are indications here, I'd say indications at least, in studies based on this one or replicating this, that can show, maybe we focus this time on the context. And the context is the breath or body or listening or some other sensory input. So it's an exciting future. I look forward to having you back to talk about more of those studies that haven't been done yet. For those who are listening, again, I'll have a link to this paper and more information. Gunesh, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners?
Yes, I have. I would like to thank a lot to Dr. Lazar for having me in her lab, and Dr. Milad for giving us his support with the design, with the analysis, with the interpretation. Dr. Hosal, she was the star, and she'll still still great. She was extremely important to me when interpreting some of the findings, creating the narrative of the paper. So I would like to thank them, our participants, Lazar Lab people, above all, for making it all happen.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. Our guest today, Güneş Sevinc. You can find out more about her. I'll have a link to her information on the episode page. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.